It was late afternoon on Saturday, July 18th, 2015, and Mary Yoder was out in her garden doing some weeding and replanting. It had rained early that morning, but now the sky over the little town of Whitesboro, located in the rural center of New York State, had the perfect amount of cloud cover, just enough to take the edge off the summer sun and heat. Mary smiled as she sat back on her heels and hooked her shoulder-length blonde hair behind her ears. Mary had just turned 60 4 months ago, but with her strong arms and slim, athletic build, she looked and felt much younger. Not that age, at least as a number, was anything that Mary spent a lot of time thinking about. What interested her much more was healthy living and enjoying all the experiences and wisdom she had gained over the years. And at 60, she'd had enough time to develop a true passion for most of her hobbies. These included making beautiful hand-thrown pottery, trying out all forms of exercise, making sure she and her family ate well, and, most recently, learning how to belly dance. But in the spring and summer, it was her prized garden that Mary loved the most. And every minute she spent out there among the flowers and vegetables, enjoying the natural beauty of her quiet surroundings, just added to her feelings of contentment and gratitude. Mary turned away from her garden and looked up from under the brim of her old baseball cap at her comfortable 4-bedroom house that she shared with her husband, Bill. Not only had the two of them been married for almost 40 years, they were also business partners and chiropractors, healthcare professionals who treated pain related to nerve and skeletal disorders by manipulating a person's body. It was a method that some of their patients referred to jokingly as, quote, getting their backs cracked. Mary and Bill had established their practice, Family Chiropractic Care, back in 1987, just 2 years after they both had graduated from Life University in Georgia with their Doctor of Chiropractic degrees. It had felt good to come back to New York. Mary had been born there, and it was where she had originally met Bill back in 1977 when they were both attending undergrad at the University of Buffalo. 28 years after setting up their private practice, Mary and Bill both still loved Whitesboro, which was nestled right between the Adirondack and Catskill Mountains in a beautiful valley of land that bordered the Mohawk River. With under 4,000 residents, Whitesboro was more like a rural village than it was a big bustling town. Many of the homes, the Yoders included, were spread out and surrounded by huge lawns and fields. Even so, the people there knew each other, and everybody seemed to know Mary. Whether she was treating patients at Family Chiropractic, located just 15 minutes away from her home, or riding her bike, working in her garden, or shopping at the local health food store and farmer's market, Mary just gave off this aura of warmth and kindness that instantly drew people to her. And when Mary smiled and spoke to you, no matter how short the conversation was, you felt like you had all of her attention and energy. But Mary and Bill's quiet, predictable, nice little life in Whitesboro was about to change. In a couple of months, on September 5th, the couple was going on the longest vacation of their married lives, a month-long cruise and European tour that they had spent all of June planning together. And even though Mary and Bill hadn't said it to each other in so many words, they both knew that this long absence from work was another step towards their full-blown retirement. Bill was almost 70 years old, and starting a few months ago, the two of them had begun scaling back their work hours. Bill now worked only 2 half-days a week at the office, while Mary worked 2 full days. And instead of being open Monday through Friday, 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m., the office was now closed on Tuesdays and Thursdays. But as Mary turned back around and knelt down beside her garden again, she secretly thought to herself that she was probably slightly less interested in retirement now than Bill was. Being 10 years younger than him, she felt like she still had quite a bit of energy left. But as she thought about this, she also remembered that even when they chose to retire, even if it was tomorrow, they wouldn't get to actually retire right away. They would need to stay on for quite a while to train the next person who was going to come in and take over their practice. So it wasn't like this retirement was going to be an immediate shift. Plus, she could keep doing her outreach work as long as she wanted to, maybe even beyond their retirement, since it didn't really involve Bill. Mary's outreach work were her regular visits to nearby Amish settlements to provide chiropractic care for them. The Amish are part of a conservative religious sect that relies on farming to support and feed themselves. The Amish are known to live a very simple life with almost no modern technology, and so a lifestyle that relies so much on physical labor often leads to aches and pains, and so the non-medical treatments that Mary could offer them were met with gratitude, along with gifts of homemade pies and jams that Mary often counted as partial payment for her services. And while this willingness to work for food endeared Mary to the Amish, that kind of bookkeeping had not exactly made her and her husband rich. But once she and Bill actually sold their practice, they would finally have both the money and the time to travel, relax, pursue their own individual interests, and spend more time with their 3 adult children and their 4 wonderful grandchildren. As Mary finally stood up from her garden and stripped off her battered and dirty work gloves, she turned and looked again at the family home. And suddenly she found herself thinking of Adam. Adam had been the last of the Yoder kids to finally move out of the house. Thinking about her 24-year-old son, the baby of the family and younger than his sisters by more than 10 years, made Mary worry. Ever since graduating from high school, Adam had stumbled in life a lot more than his 2 older sisters had. He also struggled with bouts of depression and anxiety. Even now that Adam was out of the house and living on his own, it was obvious to Mary and Bill that he didn't really know what he wanted to do with his life quite yet. He was enrolled in college, but previously, when he had been in college, he had dropped out. In fact, Adam had enrolled and dropped out of college on more than one occasion. But for now anyways, he was in school, and so Mary and Bill were hopeful that he would just continue and he would graduate, and then he would fall into a career that he hopefully enjoyed. But the idea of Adam working a serious job long-term truthfully didn't really compute. The only steady job Adam had ever held was his part and full-time jobs as office manager and receptionist at the family chiropractic offices. But Mary was hopeful for her son. He might be struggling now, but he was a wonderful young man with good intentions. For example, even though he no longer worked at the family chiropractic office because he was now focusing on school, he still made regular visits there just so he could say hello to his parents and give his mom a quick hug. He also made sure, before he stopped working at the office to focus on school, that he found his parents a replacement to work in the office. And the person he recruited was his lovely longtime girlfriend, Katie Conley. Mary and Bill initially had some reservations about this. Not about Katie, she was lovely, but about the fact that if they hired her and then she and Adam broke up, what would Katie do? Would she quit? Would she stay on? And if so, wouldn't that be really uncomfortable? And considering that Adam and Katie were one of those couples that were always on again, off again, this seemed like a pretty valid concern. But ultimately, Mary and Bill hired Katie, and pretty much right away, they knew it had been the right choice. Katie had that office humming so smoothly now that Mary couldn't even imagine the practice operating without her. Mary flexed her back and then looked up at the mountains off in the distance. Then, as she tried to push her concern for Adam out of her mind, she began walking toward the back door of the house. When she reached it, she opened it up and stepped inside, and instantly she heard Bill in the kitchen already getting a start on making dinner for the 2 of them. Before closing the door behind her, Mary took one last look back at her prized garden. The last of the clouds had cleared away, and so everything sparkled in the early evening sunlight. It was at moments like this, Mary thought, that life really did seem almost too good to be true. 2 days later, on Monday, July 20th, 2015, Mary and Bill both woke at their usual time, around 6:30 a.m. After chatting for a few minutes and making the bed together, Bill headed into their exercise room to do a short workout before he made himself breakfast and got a start on the day's activities. It was his day off, and he planned to do a little reading and tackle a few household projects on a to-do list that never seemed to actually get any shorter. As he started his exercise routine, he could hear his wife's footsteps hurrying from room to room as she got ready for a long day at work. Mary always moved at top speed, and after 37 years of marriage, Bill knew that what his wife appreciated more than anything on a Monday morning was for him to stay out of her way. And since Mary had never been much of a morning eater, Bill also knew better than to offer to make her breakfast. When they kissed each other goodbye at 7:45 a.m. that morning, Bill was struck, as usual, by his wife's vitality and her warmth. It was Monday, the start of a busy day, and Mary practically glowed with good health and energy. A minute later, she had left the house and hopped into her car. She gave Bill one more wave before backing out onto King Road and heading west toward the offices of Family Chiropractic Care. 15 minutes later, Mary had arrived at the plain white medical building with its flat roof and box-like exterior. After pulling her car into the parking space right next to Katie's, Mary hopped out, and just a minute later, she was walking through the door of the front office. Katie looked up from her computer screen, and the two women exchanged quick smiles, and Katie held up a list of that day's appointments. This was Katie's way of telling her boss that no one had canceled, and they had a full slate of patients. And sure enough, minutes after Mary's arrival, Family Chiropractic Care was buzzing with activity and people. There were the usual packages and deliveries, along with back-to-back appointments, but that was just part of it. Mary was as much a friend as she was a doctor, and so it wasn't unusual for clients to drop by in person to schedule their appointments or just to say hello. And it wasn't just the front office that was busy. Mary also ran a side business out of the back office where she sold a line of organic nutritional supplements that included her favorite, the protein powder that she herself often mixed with almond milk and used as a meal substitute or pick-me-up. By the time 12:30 in the afternoon rolled around, Mary was ready for a break. Although it would have to be a very short break, since Mary also planned to use the lunch hour to go visit her 92-year-old mother who lived in nearby Utica. Telling Katie she'd be back by 1:30 p.m., Mary ducked into the back room where she used the office blender to mix up a quick protein shake for her lunch before making the 10-minute drive to her mother's house. About an hour later, just minutes before 1:30 p.m., Mary and Katie were both back in the office and opening the door to the first patient of the afternoon. As always, it was like turning on a faucet. Almost immediately, the office was alive with the sound of voices and the gentle clink of the doors opening and closing. It wasn't until Mary's 2:30 appointment that she started to notice something was wrong. She had just said hello to her patient, a woman named Elizabeth Kelly, who had been coming to Mary and Bill for 17 years, when Mary suddenly had to excuse herself to run to the bathroom. Aside from the occasional cold, Mary hardly ever got sick, and yet here she was, her hands gripping either side of the toilet, throwing up into the toilet bowl. As soon as her stomach had calmed down, Mary stood up, she cleaned the toilet thoroughly before scrubbing her hands in hot soapy water and then rinsing her face. When she got back out to the exam room, her patient looked concerned and asked Mary if she was feeling okay. It was just very unusual for Mary to look so uncomfortable and distracted. But Mary smiled at Elizabeth and gently shook her head and said it was nothing that a hot cup of ginger or peppermint tea couldn't cure. But by late afternoon, Mary was feeling even worse, and just the thought of herbal tea, even one that was supposed to soothe digestive disorders, was enough to send Mary right back into the bathroom. By 4:30 p.m., it was obvious to Katie that her boss was not feeling well, because she was watching Mary make constant trips to the bathroom. But the 22-year-old office manager didn't want to embarrass Mary, so she kept her mouth shut. When 5:30 p.m. rolled around and it was time for Katie to leave for the day, Mary was still finishing up with her last patients. Before turning off her computer, Katie stood up and peeked her head into the exam room where Mary was working. In her quiet and now very concerned voice, Katie asked if Mary needed anything or maybe wanted Katie to stay until Mary was finished. But Mary shook her head no. She thanked Katie for the offer and told Katie to just be sure to lock the door and flip the open sign to closed when Katie left. At 6:45 p.m., Mary was finally finished with her workday. When she called her husband Bill to tell him she was heading home, she also told him that she must have picked up some sort of gastrointestinal virus and couldn't keep anything down, so don't worry about making any dinner for her. When Mary arrived home 15 minutes later, she barely paused long enough to shut the car door behind her before rushing into the house and heading straight for the bathroom. By bedtime, Mary was too uncomfortable with diarrhea, vomiting, and abdominal pains to sleep upstairs with Bill. Instead, she told her husband she'd rather just rest downstairs on the couch close to the downstairs bathroom. She told Bill not to worry and that she was sure she'd be feeling better by tomorrow. But when Bill came downstairs the next morning, Mary looked even worse. She was so pale and sweaty and disheveled that right then and there, Bill grabbed the telephone and he called their oldest daughter, Liana, a medical doctor who lived 6 hours away in Long Island, New York. When Bill described the situation to Liana, she told her father to get Mary to the hospital emergency room as soon as possible. At first, Mary wanted to wait long enough to take a bath and clean up, but even as Bill started filling the tub, Mary changed her mind. Almost too weak to stand up from the couch, she told her husband they needed to leave right now. By late afternoon, after Mary had been admitted to the hospital and doctors had begun aggressively treating her for what appeared to be a vicious stomach bug, Mary started to feel better. At about 6 p.m., Mary was finally all washed and clean, she was reasonably comfortable, and she was fully rehydrated. Also by 6 p.m., the doctors had looked over Mary's various scans of her bones and organs, and there were no signs of trauma or disease. Additionally, her blood work had come back and it was all normal. So even though they didn't know for sure, the doctors were reasonably confident that it really had just been a bad stomach bug. But because Mary's symptoms had been so severe, doctors wanted to keep her overnight, just to make sure that she really was on the mend before letting her go back home. At 9 p.m., Mary smiled at Bill, who had been sitting by her side the whole time, and told him to go back home and get some sleep. If there was any change in her condition, she or the nursing staff would give him a call. Bill thanked Mary and then gave her a kiss, and then he walked out of her room and made his way toward the front doors of the hospital. Within the hour, he was back at the Yoder house in his pajamas, brushing his teeth. When he was done, he turned his cell phone off and plugged it into a charging station in one of their empty bedrooms upstairs. Then he made his way across the hall to his own bedroom and climbed into the bed. By 10 p.m., he was fast asleep. It wasn't until the next morning at 5 a.m., when Bill heard a ferocious pounding on the front door, that he realized something must be terribly wrong. When he pulled on his bathrobe and stumbled downstairs to open the door, he saw 2 state troopers waiting for him in their gray uniforms and broad-brimmed Stetson hats. They told Bill he had to get to the hospital right away. Mary had been moved overnight from an observation room to the intensive care unit. While Bill had slept peacefully, Mary's doctors had called Bill's cell phone and their landline again and again, trying to alert him to the fact that Mary was now gravely ill and fighting for her life, but Bill had not answered. The state police escort took Bill right into the parking lot of the hospital where Mary was staying. By 5:45 a.m., Bill was sitting in the ICU waiting area, calling each of his children to tell them it was time for all of them to get to the hospital as fast as they could. Then he made the same call to Mary's 5 sisters, 2 brothers, and her 92-year-old mother. And then finally, Bill was allowed into Mary's hospital room, and what he saw shocked him. Mary, her blue eyes full of pain and terror as she looked desperately into her husband's face, was now on life support. The only reason she was still alive was because doctors had been using electrical shocks to restart her heart each time it started to fail. Surrounded by her family, Mary held her husband's hand and closed her eyes. By 2:54 that afternoon of July 22, 2015, Mary Yoder, one of the healthiest people her family had ever known, was dead. Her heart had simply stopped beating. Immediately after Mary's death, the Yoder family requested an autopsy to find out how a gastrointestinal virus or infection could have killed an otherwise exceptionally healthy 60-year-old woman. That autopsy would be performed the very next day on the morning of July 23rd, but instead of getting any answers, the initial autopsy results were inconclusive. So even after releasing Mary's body for cremation, the medical examiner's office continued to run tests on the blood and tissue samples they had collected from Mary's body. 2 days after the autopsy, on July 25th, Bill and his children invited family members and friends to join them in front of Mary's beloved gardens for a celebration of her life. It was Mary's favorite time of the year, and all of her flowers were in full bloom. Afterward, Mary and Bill's daughter, Liana, did her best to pull the shattered Yoder family back together. Liana was most like Mary in terms of temperament and her practical hands-on approach to life and fixing problems. She encouraged her father to get in touch with their Aunt Kathleen, Mary's older sister, who had also recently lost her spouse of many years. and Liana also encouraged her father and her brother, Adam, to go take a trip together to the West Coast, just a couple of weeks so they could rest and hopefully begin to heal. But the first order of business, as far as Liana was concerned, was just to get her father and siblings out of Whitesboro. The calls and visits and gifts of food from friends and patients were well meant, but especially for Bill and for Katie, who had spent hours and even days at the office on the phone canceling appointments, it was just overwhelming. So Liana invited everyone to come back to her home in Long Island for a little getaway and a much-needed change of scenery. The effort involved in doing anything seemed almost too much for Bill, but eventually he agreed. And even though Katie and Adam seemed to be in one of their relationship off cycles, Adam urged Katie to join them in Long Island too. In the weeks that followed, the Yoder family began the long process of healing. After the initial shock and disbelief over their mother's sudden and unexpected death, they had begun to accept the idea that Mary had just died of complications from a gastrointestinal infection, and they thought less and less about what the full autopsy report, which had not been released yet, might actually tell them. So, when Bill got a call on September 17th, 2015, almost 3 months after Mary's death, he was totally unprepared for what the doctors had to tell him. According to the full autopsy, Mary Yoder had not died of a gastrointestinal virus or infection. In fact, Mary Yoder had not died of any natural causes. Mary Yoder had been poisoned with a toxin called colchicine, the same drug found in a common prescription medication that is used to treat a painful form of arthritis called gout. In tiny and controlled amounts, colchicine helps reduce inflammation that causes pain. But in the lethal amount found in Mary's organs and blood, colchicine causes such profound damage to cells that the body's response is literally to order those cells to die. At first, Bill and his children were just as confused as they were alarmed by this revelation. The doctors had avoided using words like foul play or homicide. Instead, they told the family that the medical examiner's office was still evaluating the test results and considering its next steps. But less than 1 month later, on October 15th, when still no more word had come from Mary's autopsy, and so the family was left to just speculate on what might have happened to Mary, Mary's younger sister, Sharon Mills, who was convinced this was no accident, decided to just call the Oneida County Sheriff's Department and tell them as much. Oneida County was the department that served Whitesboro. And by the time Detective Van Namey had finally gotten off the phone with Sharon, he found himself agreeing that Mary's death did seem very suspicious. And so after Detective Van Namey spoke to his superiors, and they went over the autopsy report themselves, the Oneida County Sheriff's Office decided to open an investigation into Mary's death. Right from the start, Detective Van Namey knew he faced two huge challenges. Mary had died almost 3 months earlier, and if she had in fact been murdered, the trail was already going cold. He also knew from discussions with the medical examiner's office that it would be very hard to track down the source of the colchicine that had killed Mary, as doctors, either Mary or Bill, could have ordered colchicine, and since the drug also occurs naturally in some plants, investigators would have to check into Mary's gardening habits and what pesticides or chemicals she had been exposed to. And once Detective Van Namey found out that Mary was a heavy user of nutritional supplements, he knew it was possible that the poison could have been in one of her supplements. And so knowing he was getting a very late start and had some serious challenges ahead, the detective did not waste any time. He immediately requested access to Bill and Mary Yoder's phone records, and although Mary did not have a life insurance policy, so no one close to her stood to get a payout if she died, the detective still started to take a closer look at the Yoder's finances. Detective Van Namey ordered deputies to conduct interviews with family and friends to find out more about Mary's private life. He asked Katie Conley to come down to the station and give a statement about Mary's last day at work on July 20th, and he talked to the patients who had seen Mary that morning and afternoon. He arranged to have the supplements in Mary's back office at Family Chiropractic tested for the presence of colchicine, and when it came to people of interest, Detective Van Namey already had one name at the top of his suspect list. In a town as small as Whitesboro, people were bound to talk. And if some of the rumors investigators had heard were true, it sounded like maybe Mary's perfect marriage wasn't so perfect after all. It would turn out that within 2 weeks of Mary's death, Bill had indeed connected with Aunt Kathleen, like his daughter Liana had suggested he do. Kathleen had recently lost her husband of many years, and she lived near the Yoder household, and so Liana figured she would be a good person to speak to as Bill went through his own grieving process. But apparently, Bill and Kathleen had begun doing more than just chit-chatting. By mid-September, just 2 months after Mary's death, Bill had become sexually and romantically involved with his sister-in-law. That relationship between Bill and Kathleen had caused a lot of tension among Mary's other siblings. One of Mary's sisters suggested that Bill was after Mary's money, and that in the weeks just before she died, Mary had placed a call to a marriage counselor, presumably to discuss problems in her marriage. And one of Kathleen's neighbors reported seeing Bill and Kathleen sharing a passionate embrace before Mary's death, suggesting that maybe Bill was having an affair while Mary was still alive. And while all of that was still unproven speculation, detectives did know one thing for sure about Bill. Mary's husband did not have an alibi for Monday, July 20th, the day investigators were now sure Mary must have ingested the colchicine that would later kill her. When Bill was interviewed by investigators, he conceded that him being home alone all day on July 20th with no alibi did make him look suspicious, but it was the truth, and he swore he had nothing to do with his wife's death. He then told police that if she really had been poisoned on the 20th, then there were dozens of people who could have administered the toxin, because on workdays, dozens of people, clients, friends, colleagues, workers, would all pass in and out of family chiropractic, and so they would all have had access to Mary. When detectives asked Bill why he had turned his phone off and put it in the other room on the night Mary was in the hospital, Bill said he never slept with his phone nearby. It was just habit. And when he left the hospital, the doctors had told him that Mary was going to be okay, so he was not on heightened alert. And as for why he had not picked up all of the calls placed to the landline phone at their home that night, Bill said there was no landline extension in his room, so he just didn't hear the phone ringing in the other rooms, and so he never woke up to it. As for his decision to have Mary's body cremated, despite the autopsy report being inconclusive, Bill said cremation was what Mary had wanted, and the medical examiner had released her body. And Bill was told they had all the tissue and blood samples they needed for further testing. Bill also freely admitted to his relationship with his sister-in-law Kathleen, but told detectives that he and Kathleen had never been involved either romantically or sexually before Mary died. And as for Bill's relationship with his wife, Bill never wavered on his description of their marriage as being strong and getting even stronger. They were in the process of planning a month-long vacation together, and after that they were looking forward to retirement together. And according to Bill, the only reason he had even been drawn to Kathleen in the first place was because of his crippling grief over his wife's death. As for being motivated to harm his wife for her money, Bill said that was absurd. He had an inheritance that he had gotten from his father, and he knew that as soon as they sold their medical practice, he and Mary would both get to live very comfortably for the rest of their retirement. But even as Detective Van Namey began following up on all of the things that Bill had said during his interview, the investigation into Mary's death took a sudden and completely unexpected turn. On November 26th, roughly 4 months after Mary's death, both the Oneida County Sheriff's Department and the Office of the Medical Examiner received copies of a shocking letter. A letter that would instantly put a new name at the top of Detective Van Namey's list of possible suspects. A name, to that point, that no one had considered. Spread across 2 typewritten pages, the letter gave chilling details of how someone had intentionally killed Mary. And midway through the description of motive, method, and the crushing grief that the killer felt after committing the murder, the killer revealed their identity. It was Mary's own son, Adam Yoder. When Detective Van Namey finished reading this letter, he carefully slipped it into a clear plastic evidence bag. Then he took off the gloves he'd used to handle the letter and sat back in his chair. He told his deputies to get the letter over to the forensics lab and test for fingerprints and DNA. Any and everything that would help them confirm the identity of the writer and the authenticity of the letter. After tasking his forensic team, Detective Van Namey began digging into Adam's background, and it didn't take long to uncover some troubling information. Back in July 2014, a year before his mother died, Adam had been accused of rape. The charge was later dropped at the victim's request, and legally it had no bearing or place in the current investigation, but if it was true, the event that was described in the victim's statement painted the picture of someone who was definitely capable of violence and brutality. It also described a person who was jealous and needy and who struck out at people close to him. There were other red flags in Adam's background as well. There was Adam's checkered employment history. There was a civil lawsuit filed by one of his landlords that sued Adam for significant damages to an apartment Adam rented. There was Adam's intense on-again, off-again relationship with Katie. There were reports that Adam suffered from depression and anxiety, and there was Adam's financial dependence on his parents. And even though Adam did have an alibi for July 20th, the day that Mary was poisoned, it didn't actually mean that Adam could not have committed the crime. Police already knew that starting on July 15th, Adam had been in Long Island visiting his sister Liana, and he had only left Long Island at about 8 p.m. on the night of July 21st after getting the news from his father that his mother was sick and in the hospital. But according to the confession in the letter that the police received, Adam had put the colchicine into the nutritional supplements that his mother took like clockwork every day, meaning it didn't matter if Adam was not physically near his mother on the 20th. He could have put the poison into one of her many supplement powders before he left for Long Island on the 15th, and then it was just a matter of time before she actually consumed it. Finally, in December, after a meeting with all the investigators involved in the Mary Yoder case, Detective Van Namey was ready. He picked up the phone and he dialed Adam's number. Shortly after receiving the request from Detective Van Namey to come into the station for a formal interview, Adam left his apartment in Frankfort, New York, and made the 30-minute drive north to the Oneida County Sheriff's Department. At about 10:30 a.m., Adam made his way inside the brick building that housed the Sheriff's Department, where he was immediately escorted to an interrogation room. Adam did not look good. He shifted in his chair, his hand drifting to the pocket in his pants where he kept his pack of cigarettes. He'd lost weight and he seemed pale and nervous. When Detective Van Namey had called Adam earlier that morning and asked him to come to the station, he didn't mention the letter police had received 12 days earlier with Adam's confession in it. The detective had told him this interview was just routine, that earlier that week the police had also taken formal in-person statements from Adam's two sisters. And now that Adam was sitting nervously right in front of Detective Van Namey, the detective decided that instead of just confronting Adam with the information in the letter, he'd start by repeating the routine questions that investigators had asked him informally earlier in the investigation. Questions about Adam's alibi, Adam's last recent contacts with his mother, and when Adam had last been inside of family chiropractic care. As Adam appeared to relax a little bit and answered these questions the same way he had before, Detective Van Namey decided it was time to start throwing in some specific information from the letter, like the whereabouts of the poison that had been used to kill Mary. And so after Adam had answered the last of the easy questions, Detective Van Namey leaned forward and asked Adam if he would give police permission to, right now, go outside and search under the front passenger seat of his Jeep Wrangler. Instantly, Adam's whole demeanor changed. He stiffened and looked up sharply at Detective Van Namey. Then, breaking the tense silence, Adam said he really needed to speak to a lawyer. Detective Van Namey offered to get one of the court's public defenders on the phone, and a little while later, detectives left the room, so Adam's phone conversation with the attorney was private. A few minutes later, Adam hung up the phone, and the police officers came back into the interrogation room. Adam sat slouched in his chair, his elbows on the table and his head in his hands. Then, as if coming to a very hard decision, Adam reached out slowly and pulled the search and seizure agreement on the table towards him, and he signed his name. By mid-afternoon, Adam was standing in an empty parking lot outside of the Oneida County Sheriff's Department jail, watching as gloved police officers opened the front passenger side of his 1991 black Jeep Wrangler. Nervous, Adam pulled out his pack of cigarettes and lighter. He stuck one cigarette into the corner of his mouth, he lit it, and he started to smoke. A few minutes later, one of the officers who was conducting the search suddenly stepped back out of the Jeep. In his hand was now a cardboard sleeve, and nestled inside of that sleeve was a brown glass bottle, along with a crumpled up piece of paper. The glass bottle contained the deadly toxin colchicine, and the crumpled up paper was a receipt for the colchicine. The bottle of toxin had been ordered online from a company called Art Chemical by a customer named Adam Yoder, who had told them he needed the toxin to conduct a scientific experiment. However, as much as this evidence seemed to very clearly put an end to the mystery of who killed Mary Yoder, it would turn out this discovery in Adam's car was only the beginning of a much bigger and more twisted story. It would take investigators another 6 months, but they would finally uncover all the details. Here is a reconstruction of how and why Mary Yoder was murdered. Back on December 22, 2014, roughly 7 months before Mary's death, her killer walked into a New York supermarket and used cash to buy a prepaid credit card worth $150. 9 days after that, Mary's killer used that prepaid MasterCard to pay for 1 gram of the deadly toxin colchicine that they had just ordered online from a company called Art Chemicals. The killer also made sure to use a fake email account when they checked out. Because colchicine is a lethal and therefore regulated substance, Art Chemicals required a letter of intent from the purchaser that stated how the toxin was going to be used. The killer had already prepared that letter, typed on Family Chiropractic Care letterhead, saying that the poison would be used in a series of plant experiments. At the bottom of the letter were 2 signatures, Adam Yoder and Mary Yoder. 2.5 months later, on February 6, 2015, the package containing the colchicine arrived at the bustling office of Family Chiropractic Care. Like every other delivery, Katie just got up and signed for it, and then without opening it, she set it down with the other packages near the front desk. And then later that day, Mary's killer would secretly grab that package and smuggle it out of the store without anyone noticing. 5 months later, on Monday, July 20th, Mary's killer slipped into the back office of Family Chiropractic Care, where Mary kept and sold nutritional supplements. After making sure no one else was back there, the killer pulled the brown glass bottle of colchicine from their coat pocket. The killer had done plenty of research, Googling website after website that described in detail the effects of colchicine and the tiny margin that existed between lethal and non-lethal doses. 1 gram was more than enough to poison dozens of people, so Mary's killer had to measure out the exact amount, enough to cause death even if Mary sought medical treatment right away, but not enough that Mary would die immediately. Mary's killer wanted Mary's death to take a few days. This way, it would seem like Mary had died of a gastrointestinal virus or infection. The killer also knew that once they administered a lethal dose of colchicine, there was no turning back. Mary's death would be a foregone conclusion. Because colchicine is a poison that spreads very quickly throughout the bloodstream, as soon as the toxin comes in contact with a human cell, it damages the cell so profoundly that the body's response is to order that damaged cell to self-destruct. Meaning, what would appear to Mary and her family and doctors as vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal cramps was really the slow and horribly painful process of Mary's tissues committing suicide. Mary's killer carefully measured out an amount of colchicine that was equal to several dozen individual grains of sugar. Then the killer added them to the ingredients Mary would use to make her lunchtime protein shake. The killer then carefully closed the brown bottle and slipped it back into their coat pocket, and then seconds later, they were gone. A few hours later, it was time for lunch. Mary stepped into the back office, and even though she'd had a busy morning, she still had plenty of energy. She glanced at her watch, 12:30 p.m. At least her last morning appointment had ended on time, which meant she could still make the short trip out to Utica and visit her 92-year-old mother. Still thinking ahead to the rest of the day, Mary quickly moved toward the small refrigerator and pulled out the carton of almond milk and set it on the counter next to her open container of protein powder. She looked inside the can and saw there was just about one serving left. After mixing together the powder and almond milk in the blender, Mary turned on the blender and waited until the mixture was thick and frothy. A few minutes later, Mary tipped the last swallow of the protein shake into her mouth. Before leaving the office, Mary washed out the empty glass and the blender jar and called out to Katie that she'd be back in the office by 1:30 at the latest. By the time Mary left the office to go visit her mom in Utica, she was already dead. She just didn't know it yet. Sitting by herself on the couch in the living room after she had shooed her husband Bill to their bedroom upstairs, she had no way of knowing that there was no European vacation ahead for her. No retirement and no more warm summer days spent in her garden. The only thing in Mary's future now was 48 hours of intense physical and emotional suffering followed by death. Mary would have one brief period the next day in the hospital when pain and anti-nausea medication along with replacement fluids would blunt the symptoms of her body's internal collapse. But by the time Mary's husband had fallen asleep peacefully at their home on the evening of July 21st, Mary's organs had already begun to shut down. And by the time her children and husband had gathered at the hospital on July 22nd, Mary's heart would only have enough strength to keep beating long enough for Mary to say goodbye to her husband and her children. Meanwhile, as Mary slipped into cardiac arrest at 2:54 p.m. on the afternoon of July 22nd, Mary's killer sat by themselves in the quiet, empty office at Family Chiropractic Care. Caitlin Conley, affectionately known for years to Bill and Mary Yoder as Katie, their trusted family friend, their office manager, and their son's longtime girlfriend, stared at the screen on her cell phone. She was waiting eagerly for news from the hospital, and with a thrill of dark satisfaction, Katie imagined the grief and pain that Adam must be feeling as he watched his mother die. It would turn out Adam and Katie didn't just have an on-again, off-again relationship. They had an incredibly toxic and abusive relationship. And when Adam had finally broken up with Katie for good back in August of 2014 after Katie had accused him of raping her, Katie had snapped. There had been plenty of other times over the course of their 4-year-long relationship where she had manipulated Adam into getting back together with her after they'd broken up. A faked pregnancy and miscarriage, taking him to court over a loan she had made to him that he had not paid back, the threat she might commit suicide. But after that charge of rape that she had filed against Adam back in July of 2014, she knew deep down that even if they did get back together, it wouldn't be for long. Katie had withdrawn the charge, but Adam had been shocked and deeply shaken by what he said was a totally false allegation. And so by August 2014, Adam had decided that the only way to protect himself was to stay away from Katie Conley. But Katie couldn't let that happen, at least not without making Adam suffer first. So, beginning back in early 2015, shortly after their official breakup, Katie started laying her plan for revenge. She would take from Adam the thing he loved the most, the person who was always there when he needed help, his mother, Mary Yoder. And Katie would be so clever about how she planned this murder that instead of anyone suspecting her, she would make it look like Adam was the killer. She had set up a fake email account under his name and used it to buy the colchicine. She had also paid for the poison with a prepaid card she'd registered in Adam's name, and she'd signed Adam's name to that letter of intent that was sent to the colchicine distributor, Art Chemicals, saying how the poison was going to be used in a science experiment. As for conducting the actual murder, that was too easy. Katie just signed for the toxin at work, and no one noticed because she signed for all the packages. Then she took it home with her for safekeeping until July 20th, at which point she just walked into the back office, and when no one was looking, she pulled it out and she spiked Mary's protein shake ingredients. And then, following Mary's death, Katie would plant the bottle containing the toxin under the front seat of Adam's car, and then in the anonymous letter that Katie would write and send to police, she would not only tell them to look in Adam's car for the toxin, but she would also tell them that Adam was the killer, that he had confessed to her about killing his mother because apparently his mom had not been giving him the attention he needed and deserved, that he felt like she had abandoned him, and so he had snapped. But in reality, when Detective Van Namey got that letter, he didn't believe what it said. It just seemed too convenient, like whoever had written it and sent it in was probably just trying to frame Adam. And so right after getting this letter, Detective Van Namey had turned to Katie to learn more about Adam, to see who might want to frame him. And not only did Katie seem to go out of her way to paint Adam in a very negative light, she also confessed that she was the one who wrote the letter. She insisted that Adam had admitted his guilt to her, and so she had written the letter because she was afraid that if Adam didn't get arrested right away, he might hurt her, Katie, like he had hurt her when he tried to rape her. When Adam arrived at the police station for that interview on December 8th, 2015, it just didn't make any sense to investigators that if Adam was the murderer, why would he agree to a search of his car that he knew would turn up that bottle of colchicine? And when they tested that bottle for DNA and fingerprints, the only match they got was for Katie, not Adam. On June 13th, 2016, Caitlin Conley was arrested and charged with planning and carrying out the murder of Mary Yoder. If she was convicted, she would have faced life in prison. But on May 18th, 2017, after a jury could not reach a unanimous verdict, the judge declared a mistrial. It wouldn't be until the end of a second trial in January of 2018 for the lesser charge of manslaughter, which is committing an unintentional killing, that Katie would be found guilty and sentenced to 23 years in prison. In 1957, 31-year-old Larry Bader was living with his wife, Mary Lou, and their 3 kids in Akron, Ohio. Larry was a good father and good husband, but he was a terrible businessman. Over the past several years, he had launched several new business ventures, and they had all failed, throwing the family into fairly significant debt. And so even though Larry desperately wanted to be an entrepreneur and eventually start a quality business, they didn't have the money to do that. And so he had to just take some job in order to pay the bills. And so the job he got was a cookware salesman for a local company, and it did pay the bills, but it did not make Larry happy. And so on the weekends when Larry was not working, and if it was okay with his wife, he would basically just disappear and go fishing on Lake Erie, which is about an hour north of where they lived. And that was his way of kind of disconnecting from reality and kind of disconnecting from his somewhat crappy life. And so on Friday, March 15th, Larry approached his wife and said, hey, I'd like to head up to Lake Erie and go fishing for the weekend. And she would tell him, I got the kids, it's fine, you can go do that, but I heard the weather was going to be really bad. Are you sure that's such a good idea? And Larry would tell her, you know what, don't worry about it. These storms, they always hype them up. They're never a big deal. I'll be fine. And so he kissed his wife, he kissed his kids, he grabbed his stuff, he hopped in his truck, and he left and headed up to Lake Erie. That night, Lake Erie was hit with a massive thunderstorm, way bigger than the one that the news was predicting. And then the following morning, the Coast Guard discovered Larry's boat floating around on Lake Erie. There was minor damage to it, and it was missing an oar, and it was missing Larry. Larry was nowhere to be found. And so a search was launched for Larry, but he was never found, and he was eventually declared dead. And so even though the family did not have Larry's body, they would hold a funeral for him, and his wife was able to actually cash his life insurance policy, which was enough to pay for her and the kids. 8 years later, in 1965, Larry Bader's niece, a 21-year-old woman named Suzanne Peka, was in Chicago at a sporting goods show with a friend of hers. And as they're walking through the different exhibits, looking at different sporting goods equipment, they noticed over on the side of the building, there was a fairly large group of people gathered around this one particular exhibit. And so she and her friend she was with walked over to this group, and they kind of pushed their way through. And in the middle of this group was this man with an eye patch and a big mustache doing an archery demonstration. Basically, he was shooting arrows into a target about 30 feet away. And so Suzanne and her friend just kind of watched this guy for a couple of minutes, and very quickly they could see why he was attracting this big crowd, because he was just an incredible archer. He was hitting the bullseye over and over and over again. But as they continued to watch this guy, Suzanne's friend started to notice something unique about him. And he eventually turned to Suzanne and said, "Hey, doesn't this guy look exactly like your uncle who went missing on Lake Erie?" And Suzanne was kind of surprised to hear him talking about her missing uncle, but she turned and looked at this guy, and all of a sudden she saw it too. He was a spitting image of Larry Bader, her uncle, although this guy had an eye patch and a mustache, but even with that, he looked exactly like Larry. And as Suzanne is watching him, she's thinking, Larry was known for being this incredible archer, and here this guy is who looks just like him, and he's an incredible archer. And so after this demonstration was over, Suzanne and the friend ran over to this guy with the eye patch on, and Suzanne says to him, "Hey, I know this sounds totally crazy, but you look exactly like my uncle, Larry Bader, who went missing on Lake Erie 8 years ago." And so the guy, he hears her and he kind of smiles and says, "I'm sorry, I don't know Larry Bader. My name is John Johnson. People call me Fritz. I'm sorry, I don't know who your uncle is. I can't help you." But Suzanne, as she stood there staring at this guy, she was becoming more and more convinced this was Larry Bader, despite the fact this guy is saying he is not Larry Bader. And so she says to him, "No, you are Larry Bader. I'm positive you're my uncle." Now at this, Fritz would be polite but firm, and he would reiterate that, "Look, I'm not your uncle. I don't know who Larry Bader is. I don't go to Lake Erie. I just don't understand why you think I'm him. I live in Omaha, Nebraska with my wife and my kids, and I'm on TV. I do sports journalism in Omaha, and I advise archery companies, and that's why I'm here. So I don't know why you think I'm your uncle, but I'm not. I'm sorry." And with that, Fritz turned around and he walked away. And after this discussion, Suzanne and her friend were not remotely deterred from what Fritz was saying. They were completely convinced this was Larry Bader. And so they ran to a phone, and Suzanne called her two other uncles, so Larry Bader's brothers, and she explained how she met this guy that is the spitting image of their brother. And they immediately hopped on a flight that night and flew to Chicago. And the following morning, the two uncles, along with Suzanne and her friend, they went back to the sporting goods show. They went over to the archery exhibit, and sure enough, there was Fritz doing his archery demonstration. And as soon as there was a break, Suzanne, her friend, and now the two uncles, so Larry Bader's brothers, they walk over, and the two uncles, as soon as they see this guy, despite the eye patch, despite the mustache, they too would say, "This is our brother." And so they approached him and they said, "Look, I know you're saying you are not our brother. I don't know what's going on here, but you look exactly like our brother, and we have his military paperwork right here with fingerprints. Will you please just humor us and go to the police station with us and get fingerprinted? That way you can prove you really are not our brother. Please, we've been looking for our brother for a long time. This would be a huge favor to us." And so Fritz was annoyed. He didn't want to do it, but he's like, "Okay, fine. I'll go to the police station with you. I'll get my fingerprints taken, and we can put this behind us." And so that day they left the sporting goods show. They went to a police station, and Fritz had his fingerprints taken. And afterwards, the police would tell him, "You are Larry Bader." When Fritz heard this, he could not believe it. I mean, he literally did not believe he was Larry Bader. It wasn't like this revelation prompted new memories and suddenly he recalled it all. It was really the opposite. Fritz immediately is trying to rack his brain to figure out, is my whole life a lie? But there was nothing. All he had was a contiguous stretch of memories from when he was a very young child as Fritz Johnson all the way to the present. But we now know that the bulk of his memories are all not real. He was never a child as Fritz Johnson. He was Larry Bader and then became Fritz Johnson only 8 years earlier. The timeline of what happened to Larry Bader is rough at best, but as far as we understand it, Fritz Johnson showed up in Omaha, Nebraska a couple of days or a couple of months after Larry Bader went missing on Lake Erie. And when Fritz showed up in Omaha, he just Fritz walked into a restaurant and asked for a job there, and he had provided documentation that showed he was in fact Fritz Johnson, and nobody thought anything of it. He was completely normal. There was nothing unusual about his behavior, and over time, Fritz just kind of thread himself into the Omaha community. I mean, he got married, he had a child, he adopted another child, he left his job as a bartender at a restaurant and eventually got this amazing job as a sports TV broadcaster for their local channel. I mean, he was like a minor celebrity in Omaha. Everybody recognized, oh, there's Fritz Johnson. He's on TV. Hey, Fritz, how you doing? I mean, he had a full-blown life. But as soon as the news broke that he was not Fritz Johnson, he was Larry Bader, right away, the TV station he worked for fired him. His second wife left him because in reality, he actually was still legally married to his first wife. And so his marriage to his second wife was never actually real to begin with. And so she leaves him. And then also because Larry Bader was no longer dead, the insurance company that had paid out all that money to his first wife as part of his life insurance policy, they demanded that he repay them. And throughout all this drama of Fritz finding out he's Larry Bader, Fritz continued to say he was not Larry Bader, that this was all a big mistake. He just could not understand how this could have happened. None of it made sense. And so eventually a team of experts, doctors, psychologists, you name it, they came out to Omaha and they ran Fritz, aka Larry Bader, through a battery of tests over almost 2 weeks. And at the end of all their testing, they concluded that one, Fritz definitely is Larry Bader. So there's no debate there. He is Larry Bader. And two, he is almost certainly suffering from an extreme case of amnesia, which is memory loss. But the doctors and experts had no idea how he developed this case of amnesia. And of course, Fritz, he too had no idea how he developed this case of amnesia. And it's unlikely we'll ever get any more clarity on exactly what happened to Larry Bader / Fritz, because unfortunately, just 1 year after it was discovered Fritz was Larry Bader, Fritz would die. He had cancer in one of his eyes, and that was actually why he wore that eye patch, and the cancer had come back and it took his life. Today, his case is considered to be one of the most believable and baffling cases of amnesia on record. Just outside of the popular tourist town of Umaga in northern Colombia lies this thick green jungle. And if you know where to look, there is actually a walking path that leads you from Umaga deep into this jungle. And if you keep going, it will bring you all the way to this terrifying, enormous old railroad bridge that spans this huge ravine. Now, this bridge is no longer used by trains. It's been decommissioned. However, since its decommissioning, there's actually been, ironically, more traffic on this bridge, although it is the foot traffic variety. People come out to this bridge to go bungee jumping. Bungee jumping is a thrill-seeking activity where people will leap off of high places, like this bridge, and they'll jump with an elastic rope tied to their ankles. And so this rope has been very carefully measured so that when it is fully stretched all the way out, it ensures whoever has jumped will still not impact the ground. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez, who lived about an hour north of Umaga in the larger city of Medellin, she told her boyfriend that she wanted to go bungee jumping. This was something Yesenia had talked about for a long time, wanting to go bungee jumping, but every time it became a real thing and they were actually going to go do it, she would back down because she was just too scared. But for whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia had the confidence and the courage to actually see this thing through. And so her boyfriend, when he heard how serious she was, he capitalized on the opportunity because he had never bungee jumped before and he really wanted to, but he couldn't without his girlfriend. And so now it seemed like she was serious. And so right away, he called the Umaga bungee jumping company to book a slot for he and Yesenia to jump off of their bridge. So on the day they were supposed to jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend hopped in their car and they drove an hour south to Umaga. And when they got there, they found the walking trail and they made their way out to this bridge. And when they get out to this bridge, they are amazed at the number of people who were already in line on this bridge waiting to jump off of it. They knew this was a popular spot, but perhaps they didn't realize just how popular it was. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they get in line behind the nearly 100 other jumpers ahead of them, and they proceed to wait. And over the next several several hours, Yesenia and her boyfriend would have front row seats to all of the jumpers ahead of them jumping off the bridge. Now, it seems like Yesenia, in her mind, believed she would arrive at this bridge and very quickly she and her boyfriend would leap off and it would be great and so much fun. But now they've been forced to wait for a really long time. And this whole time, they're watching other people jump. And Yesenia is starting to panic. Suddenly, bungee jumping looked terrifying. It did not look like something she wanted to do. And so she was beginning to second guess her decision. And so her boyfriend, he's trying to calm her down and he's telling her, oh, it's totally safe. Look at all these people who have jumped. They're all fine. They're all smiling. They're so happy. You're going to be so proud of yourself. But despite his best efforts to calm his girlfriend down, Yesenia just could not calm down. But she did tell her boyfriend that she's not about to back down. She's going to go through with this. And so several hours went by of this totally high stress, anxious waiting period. And then finally, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line, at which point the staff members who've been doing this all day long, they signal the two to step forward and get their harnesses on. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they make their way to the edge of the platform. So they're looking out over this ravine and the staff members are putting on their harnesses and getting them ready. And the whole time, Yesenia, she's starting to get tunnel vision. Her heart is racing. She's totally panicked. She doesn't think this is fun at all. She just wants to get this over with. And then at some point, one of the staff members finally says, okay, jump. And so Yesenia jumps. Except it would turn out Yesenia had made a mistake. That staff member who had said, okay, jump, was talking to her boyfriend, not Yesenia. However, Yesenia, in her totally panicked state, had just not understood and had leapt, believing they were telling her to jump. However, the staff members had only put her harness on. They had not attached the actual elastic rope to her ankles. And so when Yesenia jumped, there was nothing stopping her from smashing into the ground. And so as soon as she leapt off the bridge, her boyfriend ripped off all of his gear and he ran down the bridge. He leapt over the railing and he ran down the hillside all the way to the bottom of this ravine. But when he finally got to his girlfriend, it was already too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined Yesenia did not die from impacting the ground. She actually died from a heart attack she suffered on the fall down, which means she must have realized after she jumped that she jumped too early, that she did not have the bungee cord attached to her legs. And so literally the fear of what was about to happen to her killed her. In early 1974, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was living happily with his wife Christine and their 5 children in Ossett, which is a small town in central England. Michael was described as a great father and a great husband who had an excellent sense of humor. In fact, neighbors, whenever they would walk past the Taylor household, would say you could often hear the sound of Michael laughing or the sound of him telling jokes to his family. But in April of that year, everything changed for the Taylor family. Michael had been doing some home repairs when he fell off of a ladder and he hurt his back. The injury itself was fairly minor, but it resulted in chronic pain. And this chronic pain quickly changed how Michael behaved. Michael went from being this cheerful, funny, happy guy to being sad and depressed. And he was so irritable that his family could barely be around him because he would lash out at them. Now, the Taylor family was not a religious family. However, most families who lived in Ossett at that time were. And so when one of Michael's friends found out about how poorly Michael was doing, they approached Michael and said, you know, you really ought to turn to religion for help and for guidance in this difficult time. And they also told him specifically that he really ought to check out this one particular Christian group. It was called the Christian Fellowship Group, and all it was a prayer group for Christians who wanted more religious support beyond just going to church on Sundays. But this friend of Michael's told him that the real draw of this group was the group's leader. Her name was Mary Robinson, and she was this 21-year-old, extremely friendly and energetic and charismatic person who just had this incredible way of making all of her members really feel like they belonged. And so Michael's friend was telling him that he really thought Marie could be the difference maker for him, that she could help him get back to normal. And so Michael, you know, he trusted this friend and he really didn't have much to lose at this point. He was already at rock bottom, and so he agrees to go check this group out. So on September 12th of that year, Michael makes his his way to the church where this fellowship group is held. He goes inside and he makes his way to one of the back rooms in the church. And when he goes inside, he sees there's a ring of people sitting in a circle, about 20 people. And as soon as they see Michael coming in the room, they all stand up and they open their arms up and they say, "Come on, come sit down with us. Welcome to the group." And then the woman who had to be Marie, she stands up and she looks at Michael, huge smile on her face, and she encourages him to come over and sit right next to me. "Welcome. We'd love to have you join our group." And so Michael, for the first time in ages, is smiling as he strides across the room and sits down right next to Marie. And then as Marie began to lead the group in prayer, Michael did not feel his chronic pain. He just felt happy again. But when the meeting was over and Michael went back home again, the pain and depression came flooding back. It was like the only place he could be happy was inside of the church at this fellowship group. And so over the next couple of weeks, Michael completely prioritized this group. He went to all of their meetings, and over the course of these couple of weeks, Michael became very close with Marie, and apparently Marie became very close with Michael, to the point where the two of them would stay after the meetings were over, and just those two would sequester themselves in quiet prayer. No one knew what they did in there, but it just seemed like they were developing a real relationship. And in fact, many people in this group suspected they were having an affair. And before long, the rumors in the church had spread outside and were all over Osset. And then before long, Christine, Michael's wife, was hearing from a friend or a neighbor that apparently Michael was having an affair with Marie. Now, Christine had already suspected her husband was having an affair with Marie because Marie was the only thing Michael talked about when he got home. So on October 1st of that year, only a couple of weeks after Michael had first attended this group, Christine waited until Michael had left the house to head out to one of the group meetings, and then Christine hopped in her car and she followed him to the church. And when she got there, she parked her car, she took a deep breath, and then she got out, she made her way to the front doors of the church, and she stormed inside, and she found the room where these meetings were held. She barges in, and she points at her husband, and she says, "I know you're having an affair with Marie, and you're going to admit it in front of this whole group." And Michael, who's sitting with his back to his wife in one of the chairs, he stands up, and instead of addressing his wife, who's accused him of infidelity, he turns and looks at Marie on the other side of the room. And when Marie made eye contact with Michael, she screamed. She would later say Michael did not look human. He looked like a beast, and he had wild eyes. And so as Michael is standing there staring at Marie with this very aggressive face, he began breaking out in tongues. Speaking in tongues is where the speaker will be saying or uttering words or sounds that sound like language, but the speaker doesn't know what they mean. The idea is some entity has come inside of their body, and this entity is dictating their speech. And so Michael is broken out in tongues. He's barking these words and sounds at Marie, and everyone inside of the room has no idea what to make of this. Everything has happened so suddenly, and it's so surprising. You have the wife suddenly coming in and aggressively accusing her husband of cheating, and Michael is not responding to it, and he's acting totally crazy. And then before anyone can do anything, Michael goes from just barking in strange languages at Marie to suddenly rushing across the room as if he's going to attack her. And when he does that, the rest of the members jump on top of him and hold him down. And despite there being like 10 or 15 people holding him down, Michael is still trying to get up, and he's screaming and snarling and yelling at Marie. And then Marie suddenly breaks out into tongues too. And it's only then that Michael stops trying to force himself up out of this pig pile that's on top of him, and instead he just continues to speak in tongues to her. And so the two of them are looking at each other, speaking in tongues, and the rest of the group is just totally dumbfounded, and so they just begin praying. And then after about an hour, Michael just collapses. It's like he went unconscious. And at that point, everybody in the room just goes silent, and they look at Michael, and then Michael kind of opens his eyes, and it's almost like he's waking up, and he begins looking around frantically, trying to figure out what had just happened. Michael would claim he had no memory of what had just happened to him. And so at this point, Marie would tell him and Christine that she believed Michael was possessed by a demonic force, and the only thing they could do at this point would be to perform an exorcism. An exorcism is an expulsion or attempted expulsion of a supposedly evil spirit inside of a person or a place. Michael and Christine were at a loss. They had no idea what to do in this situation. They were both kind of in shock for very different reasons, and so they just kind of deferred to Marie's judgment and said, yeah, I think think an exorcism is the way to go. So Christine and Michael just leave the church and go home, and then the next morning, Marie would get in touch with the Anglican Church of England and would request an exorcism. And after hearing about what was going on with Michael, the Anglican Church would say, yeah, that does sound like he needs an exorcism. And so the following day, they would send out two of their best exorcists named Peter and Raymond. And so Peter and Raymond, they get to Ossett, they go to Michael's house, and they observe him. And very quickly, they determine that it does seem like Michael is possessed by at least one demonic force. And so they tell Michael, the only thing we can do here is perform this exorcism, but we need you to agree to it. And so Michael says, okay, yeah, I agree to this exorcism. And so would his wife, because she at this point is just completely unsure what to do. She's just going along for the ride. So a day later, on October 4th at 10 p.m., Michael, his wife, and the rest of the members of this fellowship group, along with Peter and Raymond, they would all meet at this other church in a neighboring town. And as soon as Michael had been positioned in the middle of this group in this chair, Peter and Raymond began the ritual by praying. And as soon as they did, Michael began screaming out in tongues, and he began writhing around, and he fell to the ground, and he began contorting his body in grotesque positions, as if the words Peter and Raymond were saying were physically harming Michael. And so after 8 hours of this, during which they had to actually tie Michael down to prevent him from hurting other members or hurting himself, after 8 hours, they finally just came to a stop. Peter and Raymond were exhausted. It looked very much like Michael too was exhausted. And as soon as they stopped the ritual, Michael just kind of collapsed on the ground as if he had fallen unconscious. And then at some point he kind of wakes up and he's looking around wildly. He's still tied down to the ground and he's acting like he has no idea what's just happened. And at this point, Peter and Raymond, they tell him that, the exorcism was mostly successful. We identified 40 demons inside of you, and this exorcism was able to expel 37 of them. So that means there's still 3 demons inside of you. Now, we can't do it right now. We're too tired. You're too exhausted. So go home, get some rest, and tomorrow we will finish this exorcism. We will get rid of those 3 demons, and you will be just fine. And so Michael and Christine, they get their things, and they leave the church, and they head home. A few hours later, around noon, a woman who lived near where Michael Taylor and his family lived thought she heard something strange outside of her house. It sounded like someone yelling. And so she went to the front of the house and she pulled the curtain aside on one of her windows. And outside, walking down the street completely naked, covered in blood, was Michael Taylor, and he was saying something about Satan. And so this woman, she calls the police show up, and they find Michael. He had curled up on the sidewalk outside of this woman's house, and he was giggling like a child in the fetal position. And so the police approach him, and at some point Michael apparently snaps out of it, and he starts looking up at the police like he has no idea what's going on, and eventually they would get him to tell them his name and where he lived. And so after calling in backup to deal with Michael, the responding officers made their way to Michael's residence. And so they go inside, and immediately, as soon as they see what's in there, one of the officers just turns around and runs outside and begins dry heaving. The inside of the Taylor family home would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in English history. A few hours earlier, when Michael and his wife had come home from the exorcism, they had gone inside, and then Michael had fallen into one of his trances and began beating his wife. And then at some point, she fell to the ground and either was dead or was in the process of dying, at which point Michael jumped on top of her, and using only his hands, he ripped her face off and flung it across the room. And then as she's laying there bleeding to death, he began rubbing her blood all over his body. And then after she had finally died, he tracked down the family dog and killed the dog as well. Fortunately, their 5 children were not home at the time of this attack, and so they were unharmed. During Michael's trial, the prosecution and the defense blamed the Anglican Church of England and Marie and her religious group for effectively convincing Michael he was possessed with demons, which caused him to act out violently and kill his wife. And so ultimately, Michael would be found not guilty by reason of insanity, and after only 4 years of psychiatric care, he was released. And today, he is still living free in Ossett. But despite the legal outcomes of this case, there are many people, both religious and not religious, who believe the Michael Taylor case is one of the only true demonic possession cases in modern history. Also, just to close the loop, we don't know for sure if Michael and Marie were having an affair, but it is assumed they were. And so that's going to do it, guys. In 2007, the now famous cult classic movie, Into the Wild, was released to movie theaters for the first time. The movie, which is based on a true story, centers on the life of a young man named Christopher McCandless. In 1990, Christopher graduated from a really good school with honors, and by all accounts, he could have gone on to get a really good, high-paying job, but Christopher didn't want a job. He wanted freedom. And so without telling his parents, because they would not have been happy about this idea, he gave away all of his possessions, he gave all his money to charity, and he headed off to Alaska to live off the grid by himself. He eventually would find this rusted out old city bus in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness, and he would make this bus his shelter, and he would live inside of this bus for 113 days before he unfortunately died of starvation. While Christopher's story is obviously tragic, the movie about his life, Into the Wild, really focuses on Christopher's unrelenting spirit and his constant drive towards getting the thing he wants the most, which is freedom. And so at the end of this movie, the audience is left feeling not sad, but inspired. Inspired to take big risks in life and seek out adventure before it's too late. One audience member who was totally inspired by Christopher McCandless's life story was an 18-year-old young man named Matt Higgins who lived in Oregon. Matt was about to graduate high school, and unlike a lot of his peers, he had no idea what he should do after graduation, whether it was get a job or go to school. But after watching Into the Wild, a third option appeared to him, which was to head off into the wild, just like Christopher McCandless had done, except not permanently. Matt quickly fell in love with this option. He viewed it as a chance to kind of take a break from reality and go find himself, and then at the end of his stint in the wild, he could come back and, get a job or go to school. And so Matt's official Into the Wild plan was that he would graduate in 2007, and then in the spring of 2008, he would hike the entirety of the California section of the infamously rugged and beautiful Pacific Crest Trail. And he would do this all on his own. This section of the Pacific Crest Trail that he planned on hiking was roughly 1,700 miles long. It began on the border of Mexico in Southern California, and it wound its way north up to the border of Oregon. The trail cut through deserts and up and over mountains, and there was lots of dangerous wildlife to contend with. And on top of that, there were many points along this trail where hikers were very isolated. They were not anywhere near civilization, and so if anything were to happen to them, they'd be on their own. And so naturally, this hike was not a beginner hike. However, Matt was not a beginner hiker. He had grown up hiking and camping all over Oregon and the western United States. He had spent time in totally well-marked and safe areas, and he had also spent time hiking around very dangerous and isolated areas where there were cougars and bears and unmarked cliffs everywhere. And so Matt felt like, with his experience in the outdoors, he was perfectly suited to take on this big of an adventure. And in many ways, that was true. However, something was going to happen to him while he was out on the Pacific Crest Trail that no amount of hiking or camping experience could have prepared him for. So Matt graduated from high school in 2007, and in keeping with his plan, in the spring of 2008, he packed up his stuff, he headed to the airport, and he flew south to Southern California. And when he got there, he made his way all the way south to the border of Mexico, and there he picked up the start of the Pacific Crest Trail, and he began heading north. For the first few weeks of his hike, Matt would spend the entire day hiking as far as his body would allow him, and then at night, when it got too dark or when he got too tired, he would just set up his campsite right off the edge of the trail, and then after a quick bite to eat, he'd climb inside of his tent and he'd go to sleep. And then the next day, he'd get up early and he'd do it all over again. During those first few weeks, the only real adversity that Matt ever faced, beyond just kind of normal fatigue from long-distance hiking, was at one point he got a little dehydrated, and another time he almost stepped on a rattlesnake. So besides those two things, really the hike had actually been fairly routine by Matt's standards. But when he reached the Lassen National Forest, which is a very dense forest in Northern California, located about 150 miles from the end of his hike, so the border of Oregon, when he got there, this hike of his would become anything but routine. Not long after stepping foot in Lassen Forest, Matt found himself walking along this winding dirt path where the trees on both sides of this path were pressed tightly up against the edges of this trail, and because of how densely packed the trees were together, it was almost like he had these walls on either side of him that extended 100 feet into the air. And so it was very quiet and it was very dark as he was walking along, but Matt was enjoying it. All he could hear was the chirping of birds and the insects buzzing around him. It was peaceful. And so Matt's just kind of meandering his way through the forest. He's in no rush. And at some point, the trail he was on banked hard to the right. And so he makes this turn, and as he does, he looks up, and what he sees kind of startles him. About 20 feet away from him, off to the right side of the trail, is this big boulder, and sitting on this boulder are two middle-aged people, a man and a woman. They were both dressed head to toe in white. They both looked very dirty and disheveled. The man had this big, unkempt beard, and both of them were just staring daggers at Matt. And so Matt felt awkward, and he immediately looked down as he continued walking towards them. But as he got within a few feet, he looked up and kind of awkwardly smiled at them and waved and said hi, and they didn't respond. They just continued to stare at him with no discernible expression on their face, and they watched him as he walked right past them. And so after Matt walked past these two people in white, he felt really uncomfortable because he knew they were still definitely staring at him as he walked away, and he didn't want to turn around and meet their eye contact. And so he's just kind of walking away, feeling that uncomfortable feeling of someone staring at him, and he's thinking to himself, why didn't they at least wave or acknowledge him in some way? Especially considering the fact that on the Pacific Crest Trail, people go days without seeing other people. Matt, in fact, had not seen another person in days until he saw these two. And so he's thinking, how rude is that to just completely not react when another person walks past you on this trail? But Matt told himself, you know what, I don't know these people. I don't know what their issues are. For all I know, they're foreign and they didn't understand what I said. And so maybe that's why they didn't say hello back. Who knows? But you know what? It's none of my business. And so Matt just continued walking along. He never turned around to look back at these two people in white. He just carried on. A few hours later, when the sun was starting to set, Matt was still walking along this winding trail with these huge trees on either side of him, and so visibility was getting pretty poor, and so he began looking for a place to make his camp. But because of how close these trees were to the edge of this trail, and considering how dense these trees were, there was no spot for him to make his campsite without completely blocking the trail. And Matt did not want to block the trail for other people, and so what he did is he left the trail and he walked 300 feet or so into these thick trees where he found this little clearing, and that's where he set up his tent. Once it was all set up, he made some food for himself on his little stove, and then after he was done eating, he packaged up all of his leftover food inside of a waterproof bag, then he sealed that up, and then he tied some cord to the bag and threw the bag up and over a branch of a nearby tree and kind of tied it off so the bag was sitting well off the ground. This was to make sure no bears could get to his food. And so after his leftovers were secured high up in a tree, it was totally pitch black outside, and so Matt just climbed into his tent, he zipped it up, climbed into his sleeping bag, and he fell asleep. The next morning, Matt got up right as the sun was starting to rise, and so it was still pretty dark outside, but there was a little bit of light. And so Matt unzipped his tent and he looked outside, and the first thing he noticed was his bag of food that he had put up in the tree was gone. And so Matt stepped out of his tent and he looked around thinking, maybe it fell to the ground or something, but it wasn't there. It was just gone. And so Matt thought to himself, I didn't hear anything last night, but I guess a bear must have come into the campsite, found the food, and run off with it. And so Matt began walking over to the tree where he had strung the food up to begin looking on the ground for bear prints to confirm his theory that that was who took his food. And so he walks over, he's looking around, he doesn't see any bear prints, but he does see two sets of human boot prints neither of which were his. And before he could even process that, he realized these prints, these human prints, were not just underneath this tree where the food was. These prints, as he looked around him, extended all the way up to his tent and all around his tent and all over his campsite. And so as Matt is looking at this crazy trail of human prints all over the place, he's thinking to himself, how is this possible? I went to bed last night when it was already pitch black outside, and I got up basically right at sunrise, so it was still dark outside. So these two people that were walking all over my campsite and cutting my food down, they somehow navigated here 300 feet off the main trail in the middle of nowhere. They navigated here in total pitch blackness, and they did it silently without waking me up. How is that even possible? And so after running through this thought process, Matt realized the only logical conclusion was that the two people he saw on the rock, the people in white, had followed him after seeing him. They saw where he left the trail, and they had waited until he fell asleep and then snuck out and robbed him. As Matt's thinking about this, he suddenly realized that maybe they're still around. Maybe he's still being watched. And so he began whipping his head around, looking in all directions, almost expecting to see the man and the woman in white kind of poking out from behind a tree. But when he looked around, he couldn't see anyone. However, he started to get that sense that he was being watched. And so feeling really uncomfortable, he quickly packed up his campsite and walked as quickly and calmly as he could toward the trail. And as he walked, he kept thinking to himself that these people are going to jump out from behind a tree, or they're going to grab me from behind. And so he's walking faster and faster and faster. And he finally gets to the trail, and he looks down the trail and up the trail. He kind of looks all around. He doesn't see anybody. And so he tells himself, okay, they're gone. So he took a deep breath, he composed himself, and he started walking north again along the trail. Matt walked for several hours, periodically looking over his shoulder, again expecting to see the man and woman in white, but he never did. And eventually, this narrow path kind of cutting through the dense forest opened up to this big, beautiful field. And by that point, the sun was high in the sky. And so Matt's walking in this very beautiful open area. He can see in all directions. There's sunlight beaming down on him. And so even though he was totally rattled by what had happened the night before, he found himself kind of becoming more at ease about the situation. He was far less paranoid, and he began telling himself, you know, as creepy as it is that those people in white almost certainly followed him and snuck up on his campsite in the middle of the night, as bad as that is, he thought, you know what? They probably were just super hungry, and they clearly needed the food more than he did. And so, you know what? Those people, they can have my food, whatever. And so Matt just continued on telling himself he would never have to deal with the people in white ever again. However, he would be wrong. Over the next 3 days, Matt continued making his way north through the Lassen forest, and the trail he was on would weave between those big, beautiful open areas back inside those very densely forested areas where the trees were practically right on top of you. And during those 3 days, Matt did not see the people in white. He did not have any nighttime encounters with anybody. Nothing got stolen. And so that only reinforced the idea that, you know, he had been a target of opportunity. They had taken what they wanted from him, and they were no longer following him. But on the fourth day after the food stealing incident, things would get spooky for Matt again. On that fourth night, Matt was once again forced to leave the trail he was on. He was in one of those very densely forested areas and walk well off the trail to find a clearing for his tent. And so he walked, several hundred feet away. He finds this clearing. He sets up his tent. And then also he sets up a perimeter of sticks all around the outside of his campsite. This was a precaution he had begun taking after the food stealing incident. These sticks were an early warning system where if any animal or person came too close to his campsite, they would step, in theory, on these sticks and they would break and they would alert Matt in the middle of the night. And so after his campsite was all set up and all prepared, Matt sat down and had a quick bite to eat. And then after storing his food, he climbed inside of his tent and he fell asleep. A few hours later, Matt suddenly woke up. Now, when he woke up, he opened his eyes, but it's pitch black in his tent, there are no windows in his tent, and it's pitch black outside. So even with his eyes open, he can't see anything. And so he's just laying there with his eyes open, but it's total darkness, and he's just listening intently because he doesn't really know why he woke up, if something startled him, or if there's no reason at all. And so he's just laying there and he's listening. And as he's listening, he hears the distinct sound of something stepping on one of the sticks in his perimeter. And so he hears the stick break and his heart just starts racing because he knows that an animal or a person is just a few feet away from him. And so instinctively, he kind of begins to pull his arm as quietly as he can out of his sleeping bag, and he reaches over and he grabs his hunting knife. And as he grabs the handle of the knife and he brings it closer to him, he hears the sound of more footsteps. Whatever has stepped on the stick has not slowed down at all. They don't care about the sound they just made. They're still moving towards his tent. And so Matt's starting to get really freaked out because he knows that, it could be an animal, but just a couple of days ago, 2 people were in his campsite stealing his food and walking all around his tent. And so that's what's going through his head. And so Matt's laying there preparing himself to potentially have to slash out if anybody came close to his tent. I mean, he's in the middle of nowhere. If a person is out here, it's not his friend. And so he's laying there, he's kind of shaking and he's listening really intently. And the footsteps are just getting closer and closer and closer to his tent until they stop right next to his head. They are literally about a foot away from him. And so he can't see anything. He's just listening really intently. And then he starts to hear whispering. But the whispering is not coming from this person right here. The whispering is coming from everywhere in the forest. It's coming from all different directions. And so Matt doesn't know what to think about this. And as he's hearing this whispering, which is getting more and more frantic, whoever is standing right outside of his tent begins circling his tent. So now he hears footsteps just walking in a circle around his tent while frantic whispers are coming in from all directions. And so at this point, Matt is so terrified, he's just frozen. He knows that he's holding that knife, but he won't be able to do anything with it. He's just petrified. And then as soon as this total nightmare had begun, it just stopped. The whispering, silence. The footsteps stopped. And so in a way, it was kind of relieving, but in another way, Matt's laying there thinking, I want to hear the sound of footsteps retreating into the forest, leaving, but I haven't heard that. It went from footsteps all around the tent and whispering everywhere to silence as if whoever is out there is still out there. And they're just standing there waiting for him. And because it's so dark, he can't even look. He can't look outside and see. And so he's left just laying in his tent, wondering if 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 people are just waiting outside of his tent. He's got no idea. And so finally the sun would come up in the morning. And again, Matt has not heard the sound of retreating footsteps. And so maybe they're still just standing outside. But once the sun had totally come up and there was some light outside that he could see through his tent, Matt decided he just had to check. And so he reached over and he quickly unzipped the flap of the tent and he looked outside. He didn't see anyone. He leapt outside with his knife, ready to confront anyone who was out there, but there was no one. And so Matt, he's not thinking, oh, great, they're gone. He's thinking, are they just like a few feet away, hiding behind trees? And so for a few minutes, Matt just began looking all around his campsite, kind of expecting to see, those people in white or other people he doesn't know, but he doesn't see anyone. And then Matt starts thinking to himself, was this just a nightmare? Did that not even happen? Am I imagining this? But when he looked down, he saw clear boot prints all over his campsite, including a nice track all the way around his tent. And so this nightmare really had played out in real life. And so he quickly gets everything back into his pack, he throws it on his shoulder, and he just starts running back towards the trail. And when he got to the trail, he continued running north. And as he's running along and looking over his shoulder the whole time, he's telling himself, I just need to get out of Lassen National Forest. I need to get out of the people in white's turf, get away from this place, and I'll be left alone. And so that motivated him to spend the whole day moving as fast as he possibly could. And by that afternoon, he had finally escaped Lassen National Forest. He was out and he was in one of these smaller towns that kind of butted up alongside this forest. And so that night, he camped out right near this town. He wanted to be as close to civilization as possible to ensure his safety. And so as he's laying in his tent that night, he began thinking about what had happened over the past couple of days. At this point, he was nearly certain that the the people in white that he had seen on that boulder, they had to be behind these nighttime encounters. They just had to be. And so he's thinking to himself, okay, well, the first encounter I had with them, when they stole his food, yeah, that's creepy, but it makes sense. They followed him, they went to his campsite, they stole his food. Okay, fine. That makes sense to him. But the second encounter, the one that had happened the night before, that didn't make any sense. Assuming it was, again, the people in white responsible, that meant they had been following Matt the whole time, and he had not seen them somehow, even though over the last couple of days, he had been looking over his shoulder constantly, looking for those people, but he didn't see them, and they still managed to follow him all the way over several days to this other unmarked campsite, hundreds of feet off the main trail. So how did they do that? And then two, once they were at his campsite and he's laying there listening to them, walking around the campsite, whispering to each other, what were they doing? And then how did the footsteps and whispering just stop immediately and he didn't even hear the sound of them retreating into the woods? How did they do that? And so Matt would go over this and over this until finally he would fall asleep. And then the next morning when he got up, it was the first thing he was thinking about, the people in white. What were they doing and why and where were they? And so as Matt packed up his campsite that morning, it did cross his mind, that maybe he should just stop the hike right now and call his family, have them come pick him up and get out of here. But this hike, this huge hike he had planned, was really important to him, and he was only about 100 miles away from the finish line, which meant he had already hiked over 1,600 miles, and he just didn't want to quit. He wanted to finish what he started. And so he packed up his stuff, he threw it over his shoulder, and he continued on. And so that day, Matt would leave that little town, and he would make his way up into another very dense forest called the Mount Shasta forest. Mount Shasta was a lot like the Lassen forest, except Mount Shasta has a very disturbing backstory. Specifically, lots and lots of people go missing inside of Mount Shasta, and often they go missing under baffling circumstances. The most frightening of these missing persons reports are when someone comes back, the survivor of the event, and they will say, they saw their hiking companion. They clearly saw them. And then they turned their back on them just for a few moments, few minutes, whatever it was. And when they turned back around, the person they were with was now gone. No trace of them, nothing. They're just gone. And despite a massive search for them, they're never found again. There is a distressing number of missing people in Mount Shasta that sound just like that. It's totally terrifying. So with that in mind, Matt makes his way into the Mount Shasta forest, and even though it totally stressed him out to once again be walking on these dirt pathways where the trees are very tight on either side of you, they're very dense, and as he's walking, he's kind of looking in both directions, expecting to see somebody watching him. Despite feeling that way, Matt just continued to stay focused and kept telling himself to just continue on, because you're so close to the end. And so the first 3 days that he was in the Mount Shasta forest, Matt would just keep his head down and very stoically every day he would just hike as far as he possibly could. In the evening, he would set up his campsite either right off the trail or maybe a little ways off the trail in a clearing, and he didn't have any run-ins with the people in white or anybody else for that matter. He was totally left alone. But on his 4th day in the Mount Shasta forest, all that would change. On that 4th day, Matt found himself not inside one of those very dense forested areas, but rather in this very open trail that was up on the side of this mountain. And because this trail was fairly high up in elevation, the tree coverage was fairly sparse, and so there was great visibility. He could see miles ahead of him, and when he turned around, he could see miles behind him. And so Matt is just walking along this trail, kind of enjoying the day. It's beautiful outside. And at some point, he turns around and looks behind him. Now, all day he'd been doing that, and he had not seen anyone. But this time, when he turned around, he saw 2 little white dots, miles and miles back, slowly making their way along the trail that he was on. It was the people in white. They were back. At this point, Matt was at least 50 miles or more away from that first place he had walked past the people in white when they were sitting on that boulder, which meant, 1, Matt was right. These people in white really had followed him and almost certainly were responsible for the nighttime visits he was getting. And 2, for reasons unknown, they were still following him. Matt suddenly didn't care at all about completing his big hike. He just wanted to get the heck away from those people. And so very quickly he pulled out his map and he looked, and to his horror, he realized he was in one of the most isolated portions of the entire hike. He was at least 25 miles away from the nearest civilization, a little town called Castella, California. And so without a better option, Matt put the map back in his pocket. He took one last look at the people in white who were making steady gains on him, and then Matt just turned away from them and began booking it down the trail. And Matt would run for hours and hours and hours without stopping. Even when he turned around and could no longer see the people in white, he just kept on running. And then when the sun set and he could barely see the trail, he just kept on running. It literally wasn't until it was so dark outside that he actually couldn't see the ground anymore that Matt finally, totally exhausted, came to a stop. And then from there, he turned and left the trail and walked way away from the trail, hundreds of feet deep into the forest, to get as far away from these people in white as he possibly could. And so finally, he found this clearing very far away from the trail. He set up his tent right in the middle of it, and then he very diligently laid out his perimeter of sticks around his campsite, making sure there were no gaps. And then he climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up, and then keeping on all of his stuff in case he needed to make a run for it, he got inside of his sleeping bag and he just laid there with no expectation that he was going to sleep. He was terrified. As he laid there, he thought to himself, okay, I have now run at least several miles ahead of them. I know that was them. I know I got some distance on them. There's no way they saw where I turned off the trail and where I've set up this campsite, so they can't possibly find me. And so Matt would lay in the tent for several hours just waiting to fall asleep. And then finally he would start to get tired because at this point it's totally quiet outside. He hasn't heard anything. And so he begins to doze off to sleep. And as he's getting more and more tired, he hears the sound of someone stepping on his perimeter of sticks. And as soon as he hears that stick break, he hears the all too familiar whispering pick up all around the forest. And then something new happens. Before Matt can even do anything, his tent lights up like a Christmas tree. Someone is shining a light on his tent. Someone has snuck up on his campsite in the middle of nowhere, hundreds and hundreds of feet off the trail, in the middle of the night. They've found him, and they're shining a light on him. And then the light clicks off, and it's silent. And at this point, Matt's fight or flight instinct kicks in, and he rips off his sleeping bag, he jumps outside and begins screaming nonsense and flailing around with a knife, trying to intimidate these people to get away from him. And then after he stops for a second, he hears a stick crunch right behind him. And he whips his head around to look at who is standing right behind him. And as he's turning out of his peripheral vision, he sees a dark figure running towards him. He doesn't think twice, he just turns and begins running away from the campsite. Now remember, it's pitch black in the forest. There's trees everywhere. And so Matt's smashing into trees, branches are hitting him, he's falling to the ground, but he is on a pure adrenaline high, and he is just sprinting as fast as he possibly can away from this person who is likely still chasing him. And after 5 minutes of running, he stumbles and falls forward and kind of lands at the base of this fallen tree. The tree had landed in such a way that it was kind of propped on a rock, so there was a small gap underneath the tree. And so Matt, thinking quickly, kind of slid himself underneath this log and positioned himself so he was looking back in the direction he was running from. And as he laid there, he saw in the distance this light bobbing around. These people are looking for him. They're searching the forest for him. And so he watched in horror, tucked underneath this log, as whoever had the light and whoever else was with them, they moved closer and closer and closer, but they did not find him tucked underneath the log. They just walked right on past him. And so Matt would remain underneath this log all night until finally the sun came up. And at that point, even though it was fairly obvious that whoever was looking for him, they were now gone, Matt was still terrified. And so he stayed under the log for several hours until it was about early afternoon. And then he finally pulled himself out from under the log and he looked around. He couldn't see anyone. And then instead of going back to his campsite and getting his gear, he just totally abandoned it. He was worried that these people in white or whoever it was, that they were still going to be there. And so so he just turned and continued running away from his campsite back out to the trail. And once he got the trail, he continued running on the trail all the way to Costella, California. And when he got there, he hitchhiked his way to the town of Mount Shasta. And there he would speak to police as well as the Forestry Service about what he had experienced. And so they would take all of his information down and they would put him up in a motel for the night. And then the next day, Matt would get in touch with his family and they would drive from Oregon to Mount Shasta. They would pick him up and they would take him back home. Months later, Matt would contact the Mount Shasta Police and the Forest Service and would just follow up and say, hey, have you learned anything else about these people in white? Have you caught them? Has anybody else come forward? And the police would say, they did have a number of people coming forward saying that things had been stolen from their campsites. These are people that were in Mount Shasta, in Lassen Forest, and the surrounding forests. But Matt was the only one who had reported being terrorized by this mysterious couple in white. And so to this day, Matt has no idea who those two people were, what they wanted with him, beyond obviously the food they took. I mean, they continued to stalk him for nearly 100 miles. And he has no idea how they were able to keep finding his campsites that were hundreds of feet off the main trail in unmarked areas that they would somehow navigate to in total darkness without alerting Matt. It's all a big mystery. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please hide a Bluetooth speaker in the like button's bedroom and then proceed to play Siberian Husky screaming audio all night long. Also, please subscribe. To our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast where we upload brand new, never before heard podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings. And then on Thursday mornings, we upload remastered audio from some of our most popular YouTube videos. Again, the podcast is just called MrBallen Podcast, and you can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, anywhere you find podcasts, you can find it there. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts, which just posts random short videos and lost episodes. And the other channel is called MrBallen en Español, and it's a Spanish language channel. We also post near daily content